Aspen Silver Hills, Colorado, October 1908. The air was already thin and sharp, a promise of the winter that hunted these high valleys. Below, in the company town, the sensible rectangular shapes of miners' cabins were buttoned up tight, smoke pluming straight into the hard blue sky. But up on the stake, claim overlooking the valley, Conrad Steinhauser was doing something that made no sense at all. He was building a roof out of rocks, not shingles, not slate. He was wrestling 8-inch thick slabs of fieldstone, some weighing over 100 pounds, up a wooden ramp onto the pitched southern face of his severe A-frame structure. His shoulders, thick from a life of similar work in a different world, strained against the weight. Each stone was set with agonizing slowness into a bed of mortar over a layer of tarred lath. Beaumont Markham, the mine housing superintendent, stopped his horse on the track below, watching the scene with a practiced, professional frown. He was a man who understood board feet, load-bearing walls, and the brutal calculus of a Colorado winter. What he was seeing was not just unconventional. It was, in his expert opinion, suicidally foolish. What in God's name is that Austrian doing? Silas Croft, the lumberman riding with him, reined in his own horse. That's a ton of granite he's got up there already. That's not a roof, it's a quarry. Markham grunted, his gaze fixed on the impossible structure. It's a deadfall trap. He's building a tomb for his own family. The moment the spring thaw hits that mortar, the whole south face is going to slide. I've seen rock slides with less stone than he's putting on that roof. He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and professional disgust. The man was clearly mad. What did this Austrian Holzknecht mason, this wood and stone man from the Tyrolean Alps, understand about thermal mass and solar gain that the experienced mine housing superintendent, a master of frontier construction, had missed? The answer was written in the angle of the sun and the very nature of the stone itself. If you stay with us, I promise you will learn the precise physics of how a simple stone wall can become a solar engine, a battery that stores daylight to fight the longest, coldest nights. We share these stories of forgotten ingenuity not just for entertainment, but because the principles they reveal are as true today as they were a century ago. Let us know in the comments what you think is the most overlooked natural resource for building. Now let us return to the man everyone thought was a fool. Conrad Steinhauser was not a carpenter, not in the way the American West understood the term. He was not a miner, though he worked a small silver claim to feed his family. He was a Holzknecht mason, a title that had no direct translation and even less meaning in the Sawatch Range. In the old country, he had worked with the giants, limestone cliffs, ancient firs, and the crushing weight of alpine snow. His hands knew the language of granite, the heft of timber, the precise angle at which a roof must be pitched to shrug off the burden of a 10-foot snowfall. He had built chalets whose stone bases were centuries old, their timbers groaning but holding fast against winds that could peel the bark from a tree. His tools were not just the saw and hammer of the frontier, but the trowel, the stone chisel, and an innate understanding of how heat moved through solid objects. He had come to Colorado with his wife, Annalise, and their 2 small children, Lucas and Heidi, for the promise of land and the clean, sharp air that reminded him of the high alpine meadows. But their first winter, in 1907, had been a lesson in a different kind of cold. It was a dry, predatory cold that leached the life from everything it touched. They had lived in a standard-issue company cabin, a box of green pine logs, chinked with mud and newspaper. It was a structure designed to be built quickly, not to be lived in. That winter had nearly broken them. Conrad remembered with a clarity that still chilled him the small, devastating moments of its tyranny. He watched Annalise carry a basin of lukewarm water from the stove to the washstand, a distance of no more than 8 feet, and see a skin of ice form on its surface before she could set it down. The coal they bought at exorbitant prices from the company store would freeze in the scuttle by the door, the moisture in the bituminous lumps welding them into a single, unburnable black mass. He had to bring the entire scuttle inside and set it by the fire for an hour just to break a few pieces free. Most terrifyingly, the mantle barometer, their one piece of scientific equipment, had failed. The needle dropped during a particularly brutal cold snap and simply stopped moving at midnight, frozen in place, as if time itself had died. That was the winter he understood the American cabin was a thermal sieve, a glorified tent made of wood. It didn't hold heat, it merely slowed its escape for a few desperate hours. He swore he would not let his family endure another winter like it. The problem wasn't the fuel. The problem was the container. The conventional cabins that dotted the hills around Aspen were monuments to a fundamental misunderstanding of heat. Beaumont Markham, for all his practical experience, saw a house as a barrier against the cold. You built a wall, and on the other side of that wall was winter. You burned fuel inside the wall to fight the cold that inevitably seeped through. A bigger fire meant more warmth. It was a simple and brutally wrong equation. These cabins were built of logs, typically pine or spruce, with an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1.4 per inch. An 8-inch log wall, therefore, had an R value of just over 11. Chinking, no matter how well applied, was a constant source of infiltration. The structures possessed virtually no thermal mass. When the fire in the stove burned hot, the air in the cabin became warm. The moment the fire died down, that warmth vanished. The heat radiated straight through the thin wooden walls and out into the 20-degree air. The logs themselves, once chilled, became a source of cold, radiating a deep, penetrating chill inward. Families like that of Jedediah Thorne, a fellow miner, were engaged in a losing battle. They burned through 4, sometimes 5 cords of wood or tons of coal in a single winter. The stove would glow red hot, creating a small bubble of habitable space around it, while 6 feet away, frost would be climbing the interior walls. Thorne's wife wrapped their children in every blanket they owned, and they still slept in their coats. The air was thick with smoke, but the cold was thicker. It was a constant, draining siege. Markham's solution was always the same. Build it tighter, chink it better, burn more fuel. He was trying to plug 1,000 tiny holes in a ship that was fundamentally unseaworthy. He saw the cold as an enemy to be repelled. Conrad Steinhauser saw the sun as an ally to be captured. Conrad's work began not with wood, but with stone. He and Annalise spent the late summer digging a foundation, not the simple pier and beam common to the area, but a proper half wall, 3 feet deep, made of river stone and mortar. This would be their anchor. Upon this he built the A-frame. He used stout fir timbers, planed by hand, for the primary rafters. The angle was critical. He used his Tyrolean framing square and a plumb line to ensure the pitch of both faces was exactly 42 degrees from the horizontal. Silas Croft, the lumberman, had scoffed at the angle. "Too steep," he'd declared to anyone who would listen. "Wastes half your space and a pain to build." To Conrad, the angle was everything. It was the angle that would encourage the snow to slide off before its weight became a threat. And more importantly, it was the angle that would present the southern face to the low winter sun, almost perpendicularly, like a leaf turning itself toward the light. The construction of the frame was swift. Annalise, strong and capable, helped him hoist the timbers into place. They worked in a quiet rhythm, their movements economical and sure. The mockery from the valley below was a constant hum, but they paid it no mind. Once the frame and the north-facing roof were sheathed in traditional planking and tar paper. The real work began, the strange work. On the south face he laid down a deck of rough sawn pine, then covered it with a thick, sticky layer of tarred lath. This was his waterproof membrane. Then came the stones. For weeks he had scoured the surrounding hills, not for gold or silver, but for flat, dense slabs of granite and schist, the kind of stone that felt heavy and solid in the hand. He chose them like a jeweler, choosing gems, looking for pieces between 6 and 10 inches thick, with at least one relatively flat face. He built a ramp of heavy timbers against the south face of the A-frame. Using a simple block and tackle rigged to the ridgepole, he and Annalise would haul each stone, one by one, up the ramp. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. He would position the stone, trowel a thick bed of lime sand mortar onto the tarred lath, and then, with a final grunt of effort, lever the slab into place. He started at the bottom, atop the foundation wall, and worked his way up, course by agonizing course. The south face of his house slowly transformed into a monolithic wall of rock, a mosaic of gray and tan, tilted toward the sky. It was during this phase that Beaumont Markham made his official visit. He rode up, not as a neighbor, but as the mine-housing superintendent, a man with authority. He dismounted, his face a mask of grim certainty. "Steinhauser," he said, his voice flat, "I've filed a report with the company housing office. For your own good, you need to stop this." Conrad paused, a trowel heavy with mortar in his hand. He looked at Markham and waited. "I've done the calculations," Markham continued, his tone becoming more forceful, as if explaining a simple sum to a child. "You have, by my estimate, over 12 tons of stone on that pitch. Your rafters are 888 fir. They're not rated for that kind of static load, let alone a live load of wet spring snow. The first time you get a thaw followed by a hard freeze, that mortar is going to fracture. The whole thing will come down on top of you. It's a matter of physics." Conrad wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He looked at the stone he had just set, then back at the superintendent. He spoke quietly, his German accent softening the edges of the English words. "The stone is not on the roof, Mr. Markham. The stone is the roof." He then turned back to his work, picked up another trowel of mortar, and the conversation was over. Annalise watched from the doorway, her hands wrapped in her apron. Later that evening, as they ate their simple meal of bread and soup, she touched his arm. "Conrad," she said softly, "the men in the valley, they say the house will fall." He looked at her, his face tired but his eyes clear. "In my valley," he said, "the mountains are made of stone. They do not fall. This house will stand." She saw the certainty in his eyes, a knowledge deeper than calculation, and she believed him. The principle Markham missed was thermal mass. He saw the stone as dead weight. Conrad saw it as a living battery. The science is as simple as it is elegant. Different materials absorb and release heat at different rates. A log cabin with its low-mass wood heats up quickly and cools down just as fast. It's like a paper cup, easy to warm, but it holds no heat. Stone is the opposite. The fieldstone Conrad used had a density of approximately 165 pounds per cubic foot. A material this dense has a high capacity to store thermal energy. On a clear winter day in Colorado, the sun, though low in the sky, delivers a significant amount of solar radiation, hundreds of BTUs per square foot. Because Conrad had pitched his stone wall at 42 degrees, the rays of the winter sun struck it at an almost direct 90-degree angle, ensuring maximum absorption. The dark, rough surface of the stone was a perfect collector. Over the course of a 6-hour winter day, the 8-inch thick stone wall would absorb this solar energy, slowly, steadily. The surface temperature of the stone could rise by as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit over the ambient air temperature, even on a day when the air itself was near zero. This stored heat, thousands upon thousands of BTUs, did not stay on the surface. It slowly migrated through the dense stone. Then, as the sun set and the landscape plunged into the deep, breathless cold of a high-altitude night, the process reversed. The flow of heat is always from a warmer object to a colder one. Inside the cabin, the air temperature would begin to drop. But the stone wall, now significantly warmer than the interior, began to radiate its stored energy inward. It became a silent, gentle furnace. Conrad had calculated that his wall held enough thermal energy to continue radiating palpable warmth for more than 16 hours after the sun had set, releasing it slowly and steadily throughout the entire night. He had not built a barrier against the cold. He had built a reservoir of warmth, filled for free every single day. The structure itself, the A-frame, was also a work of quiet genius. Markham's fear of snow load was valid for a conventional roof, but the 42-degree pitch was designed to work with gravity, not against it. It was steep enough that once the snow depth reached about a foot, its own weight would cause it to shear and slide off in a clean sheet. This meant the structure would shed an estimated 32% of a storm's total snowfall before the load ever approached the critical limit of 12 pounds per square foot. The house actively managed its own burden. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an occupying army. In early December, a weather pattern the old-timers called a Sawatch Arctic outflow settled over the Rockies. A vast, heavy mass of continental Arctic air slid down from Canada and stalled over the high peaks. For 13 consecutive nights, the temperature in the valley plunged to 32 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it felt solid, a physical weight on the lungs. The world became brittle. Trees groaned, their sap frozen solid. The sound of an axe striking wood was like a gunshot, sharp and violent. In the company cabins, it was a time of misery. At the Thorne household, the battle was constant. Jedediah and his wife took turns staying up all night, feeding the stove until it roared. But it was never enough. They hung blankets over the door and windows, but the cold found every crack. Their meager supply of potatoes, stored in a bin against an exterior wall, froze solid. Their children, pale and coughing, lived in a small, smoky circle of warmth, venturing out of it only when necessary. The cabin was a failing outpost in a frozen sea. In the stone A-frame on the hill, life continued with an impossible, almost sacred, sense of normalcy. When the Arctic outflow hit, Conrad felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. This was the test. The first night, the temperature inside the cabin, with only a small cooking fire in the stove, dropped to a cool but entirely livable 58 degrees. Outside, the world was freezing solid. The next morning, the sun rose into a flawless, crystalline sky. Its rays, though carrying no perceptible warmth in the frigid air, struck the great stone face of the house. By mid-morning, the rocks were beginning their slow, steady drink of light. Inside, there was no frantic stoking of the fire. Annalise was baking bread. The smell of yeast and warm flour filled the single, high-ceilinged room. Lucas and Heidi, their children, were not huddled in blankets. They were sitting on the floor, on a bearskin rug, playing with carved wooden animals. They were in their shirt sleeves. The air was not just warm. It was a stable, comfortable, and even warmth. The stone wall to the south radiated a gentle, pervasive heat that felt like a permanent, silent sunrise. The ultimate proof of this strange new reality sat on a small wooden shelf Conrad had pegged directly into the interior stone wall. Before the cold had set in, a visiting pastor had given them a small wedge of Sacher Torte, a dense Austrian chocolate cake, a rare and precious luxury. Annalise had placed it on the shelf, intending to save it for Christmas. In any other cabin in that valley, the cake would have become a rock-hard frozen brick within hours. The miners' chocolate rations in the bunkhouse were so brittle They would shatter like glass if dropped, and the men would use a coal hammer to break off pieces. But on Conrad's shelf, the Sacher Torte remained soft. Every evening, Annalise would touch it with her finger. The cake was cool, but it was pliable. The chocolate icing yielded to her touch. It was a small domestic miracle, a testament to the fact that within these walls, the fundamental laws of winter had been suspended. Outside, the contrast was just as stark. The north pitch of the A-frame, perpetually in shadow, was caked in a thick, crystalline layer of hoarfrost, glittering and cruel. But the south face, the great stone wall, remained almost entirely clear. Even hours after sunset, as the temperature plummeted, anyone brave enough to place a hand on the stones would feel a faint, residual warmth bleeding out into the killing cold. The house was breathing heat. The breaking point for Beaumont Markham's certainty came not from argument or reason, but from the simple failure of a piece of wood. In the middle of the Arctic siege, he was leading a company sleigh rig up a pass to check on a remote mining outpost. The cold was relentless. The horses' breath plumed and froze instantly on their muzzles. The wood of the sleigh groaned in protest. Suddenly, with a crack that echoed across the silent landscape, the main draft pole, frozen and brittle, snapped. They were stranded. "Nearest shelter is the Steinhauser place," one of the men said, his words muffled by a thick scarf. "About a mile back." Markham cursed under his breath. The Austrians' madhouse. But they had no choice. They unhitched one of the horses and began the trek back, leading the animal through the deep, squeaking snow. As they approached the A-frame, Markham was struck by its alien appearance in the frozen world. It looked less like a house and more like a feature of the landscape, a great, snow-dusted rock angled toward the sun. There was no plume of desperate, heavy smoke from its chimney, only a thin, lazy wisp. It was just past noon. The sun was at its apex in the southern sky, a distant, cold disk. As Markham drew closer, he saw something that made him stop. The surface of the stone wall was shimmering. A faint heat haze was rising from the rocks, distorting the air. It was impossible. The air temperature was at least 20 below zero. He walked up to the south wall, driven by a deep, professional curiosity that momentarily overrode his skepticism. He expected to feel the biting, energy-sucking cold of stone at sub-zero temperatures. He had felt it 1,000 times on mine facings and foundations. He pulled off his thick leather glove, his bare hand pink and aching from the cold. He hesitated for a second, then pressed his palm flat against the surface of a large gray slab of granite. The shock was not of cold, but of warmth. It was not hot, but it was unmistakably, profoundly warm. It was the temperature of a living thing, a deep, radiant heat that soaked into his frozen hand, chasing the ache from his bones. He stared at his hand, then at the stone, then back at his hand. Everything he knew about construction, about heat, about winter, dissolved in that single tactile sensation. He understood in a way no blueprint or calculation could ever have taught him. The wall was alive. Conrad opened the door before he knocked. He had seen them coming. He simply nodded at Markham. "Your pole is broken," he stated. Markham could only stare. He finally found his voice, but it was quiet, stripped of all its former authority. "Conrad," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "You didn't build a roof. You built a winter sun." The conversion of Beaumont Markham was as total as it was sudden. He became the stone house's most powerful advocate. The story of his frozen hand and the warm stone wall spread through the mining camps faster than gossip. When spring finally came, and the house did not collapse, the mockery turned to awe, and then to imitation. That May of 1909, at a regional meeting of the Western Federation of Miners, Markham himself presented Conrad's design to the Housing Committee. He used his authority not to condemn, but to praise. He spoke of thermal mass, of solar gain, of the simple, undeniable proof of a family living in shirt sleeves while their neighbors froze. The Federation, a practical body concerned with the well-being of its members, officially included the Steinhauser stone-pitched A-frame in its winter housing recommendations. By the following autumn, the landscape of the Saguache Hills began to change. 11 families, emboldened by Conrad's success and Markham's endorsement, built their own versions of the stone house. They were not all as elegant as Conrad's, but they all followed the same core principles: a steep southern pitch, a heavy cladding of stone, and an orientation to the winter sun. The results were immediate and revolutionary. Families reported cutting their fuel consumption by over 70%. More importantly, for the first time, they were not just surviving the winter, they were living through it. Conrad Steinhauser's innovation was not born of academic theory or engineering blueprints. It was an artifact of memory, an echo of an ancient building tradition from the other side of the world. Yet in his simple application of stone and sun, he had anticipated the principles of modern passive solar design by more than half a century. Building scientists today speak of Trombe walls, of direct gain systems, and of thermal mass engineering, using complex equations to model the very phenomena Conrad understood in his bones. He had no language for BTUs or R values, but he knew the feel of a sun-warmed rock at dusk and understood that this was the key to decoupling a family's comfort from the fire in their stove. The story of the stone A-frame is more than a tale of clever construction. It is a lesson in perspective. The other settlers saw the Colorado winter as an overwhelming force to be endured, a brutal enemy to be fought with fire and thick walls. They built their cabins like fortresses, hunkered down against the siege. Theirs was a story of resistance. Conrad saw it differently. He understood that the same sky that delivered the killing cold also delivered a torrent of free energy, even on the shortest day of the year. He saw the forces of nature not as adversaries, but as powerful, predictable partners. The cold was a reality, but so was the sun. Gravity could crush a roof, but it could also be used to shed the snow that caused the load. He didn't lay stones against the cold. He used his knowledge to teach the south face of his house how to drink the sun and feed his family with its warmth by night. He built not a fortress, but a relationship between his home and its star. The frontier did not reward resistance. It rewarded collaboration. We hope this story has given you a new appreciation for the hidden genius of the past. The principles of thermal mass and passive solar design are as relevant as ever, offering a path toward more sustainable and resilient building. If you found this story of ingenuity compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. And let us know in the comments, what modern technology do you think owes a debt to this kind of simple, practical frontier innovation? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.